I was about to move, to approach him, when Jason suddenly turned and stormed back towards the mansion. Panic surged through me, and I ducked back into the shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear his footsteps approaching, each one sending a jolt of fear through me. I wasn't ready to face him, not after what I had just seen, not with the questions burning in my mind. But before I could slip away, Jason rounded the corner and stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes locking onto mine. "Eve," he breathed, his voice low and dangerous. "What are you doing out here?" I made to answer, but what followed suit was stutter. He eyed me and merely brushed past me to walk right back into the house. The next few days after that night in the garden were a blur of tension and unspoken words. Jason and I avoided each other even more than before, but the atmosphere between us had shifted dramatically. The truce we had formed was shattered, replaced by an even thicker layer of tension that neither of us could break through. But the memory of that night haunted me. The way Jason had grabbed Leo, the fury in his eyes, it was unlike anything I had seen in him before. It was more than just anger, it was something deeper, something that unsettled me in ways I wasn't ready to confront. I tried to push it all to the back of my mind, but it was impossible. Every time I saw Jason, I was reminded of the raw intensity that had flashed in his eyes when he had confronted Leo. And it made me question everything I thought I knew about him. One evening, I was in the kitchen preparing a simple dinner when I heard Jason's footsteps behind me. I stiffened, but didn't turn around. I could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on me, making it hard to focus on the task at hand. "Eve," he said, his voice low and rough. I kept my back to him, pretending to be engrossed in slicing vegetables. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched out, thick with unspoken tension. Finally, he spoke again, his tone sharper this time. "You need to stay away from Leo Blackwood." I froze, the knife in my hand hovering above the cutting board. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me. "And why is that, Jason?" I asked, my voice carefully controlled. Afraid I might actually enjoy his company? His hand came down on the counter next to me, hard enough to make me jump. "This isn't a joke, Eve," he snapped. "He's dangerous." I turned to face him, meeting his gaze head-on. "Is that why you nearly choked him the other night? Because he's dangerous? Or was it something else?" Jason's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening with something I couldn't quite name. "He's interested in you, Eve," he said through gritted teeth. "And trust me, that's not a good thing." A cold knot formed in my stomach at his words, but I refused to let him see how much it affected me. "Interested in me?" I repeated, forcing a bitter laugh. "Why should that matter? This marriage is just a contract, remember? What do you care if Leo is interested in me?" Jason's expression hardened, and he took a step closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "You think I don't care? You think I'd let him anywhere near you if I didn't?" My breath caught in my throat at the intensity in his voice. There was something almost possessive in his tone, something that sent a shiver down my spine. But I couldn't let myself believe it. Jason had made it clear from the start that this marriage was nothing more than a business arrangement. He didn't care about me, not really. Why do you care, Jason? I challenged, crossing my arms over my chest in a defensive gesture. You've made it perfectly clear that you hate me. So, why does it bother you so much if Leo is interested in me? He stared at me, his eyes blazing with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something that would finally give me the answers I needed. But then he shook his head, stepping back as if he had been burned. It's not about hate, Eve, he said, his voice cold and distant. It's about keeping you safe. I wanted to push him, to demand that he explain what he meant, but the look in his eyes stopped me. There was a vulnerability there, a crack in his usually impenetrable facade, and it made me hesitate. Because as much as I wanted to fight him, to make him admit that there was something more between us, I was scared of what that admission might mean. Instead, I looked away, focusing on the vegetables still scattered on the counter. I can take care of myself, Jason, I muttered, my voice lacking the confidence I had hoped for. Jason let out a harsh laugh, and I could feel his frustration radiating off him. You really don't get it, do you? I whipped my head around to face him, my own frustration boiling over. Then explain it to me. Stop dancing around whatever it is you're trying to say, and just tell me the truth. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, his expression hardening once more. You wouldn't understand, he finally said, turning on his heel and leaving the kitchen without another word. I stood there, staring after him, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and confusion. Why couldn't he just be honest with me? Why did he always have to hide behind this cold, distant facade? The rest of the evening passed in a haze of irritation. I couldn't stop thinking about Jason, about the way he had looked at me, the way his words had cut through me. And I hated that it bothered me so much. I hated that I cared. But as much as I tried to deny it, I couldn't shake the truth. I was starting to fall for him. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I sank into one of the chairs at the kitchen table, burying my face in my hands. How could I let this happen? How could I let myself develop feelings for a man who clearly wanted nothing to do with me? I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside me. No, I couldn't allow this. I couldn't let myself fall for Jason. Not when he would just hurt me in the end. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, I couldn't ignore the warmth that spread through me at the memory of his words. He cared about my safety, about keeping me away from Leo. That had to mean something, didn't it? The following days were filled with the same tension, the same push and pull that had come to define our interactions. Jason remained distant, his emotions locked behind a wall I couldn't break through. But there were moments, brief flashes of something more, when I caught him looking at me with an intensity that sent my heart racing. One evening, as I was heading to bed, I found him sitting in the living room, staring into the fireplace. The flames cast a warm glow over his features, softening the hard lines of his face. He looked almost vulnerable, lost in thought. I hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to approach him or retreat to my room. But something in his expression drew me in, and before I knew it, I was sitting down beside him on the couch. He didn't acknowledge my presence at first, his eyes still fixed on the fire. But then, without turning to look at me, he spoke. "I never wanted this, you know," he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. I frowned, unsure of what he meant. "Wanted what?" "This marriage," he said, finally turning to meet my gaze. "This mess. It wasn't supposed to be like this." I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that I hadn't seen before, a glimpse of the man behind the cold exterior. "Then why did you agree to it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jason let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Because I didn't have a choice. Because it was the only way to protect what I care about." I wanted to ask him what he meant, to push him for more, but I could see the walls going back up, his expression hardening once more. "You should get some rest," he said, standing up and turning away from me. "It's late." I watched him walk away, a mixture of frustration and sadness gnawing at me. Every time I thought we were making progress, that I was getting closer to understanding him, he would pull away, retreating behind the walls he had built around himself. But despite that, despite the pain and confusion, I couldn't stop the growing feelings inside me. I was falling for him, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. As I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I made a decision. I would keep my feelings hidden, buried deep where they couldn't hurt me. I would focus on getting through the rest of this contract, on keeping my heart safe. But deep down, I knew it was already too late. The days that followed were a delicate dance of avoidance and lingering glances, each moment heavy with the tension that neither of us could fully escape. I kept my distance from Jason as much as possible, yet I was acutely aware of his presence in the mansion. Every footstep, every creak of the floorboards sent a ripple through me, reminding me of the man who is constantly on my mind. Despite my resolve to keep my feelings hidden, they refused to stay buried. I found myself looking for him, hoping for those brief moments when our paths would cross. My heart betrayed me every time his eyes met mine, a spark of something unspoken passing between us. One evening, I was in the library, pretending to read a book I had no real interest in. The words on the page blurred as my thoughts wandered back to Jason, to the way he had looked at me with something that resembled regret. I had tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just a fleeting moment, but the memory of it haunted me. Just as I was about to close the book and retreat to my room, the door to the library creaked open. My heart skipped a beat as Jason stepped inside, his gaze immediately finding mine. There was a moment of hesitation in his eyes, as if he was deciding whether to stay or leave. But then he walked over to the armchair across from me and sat down, his expression unreadable. I forced myself to stay calm, to ignore the way my pulse quickened at his proximity. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. He shook his head, leaning back in the chair with a sigh. "No. Too much on my mind." There was something about the way he said it, a weariness in his tone that tugged at something deep inside me. I had seen glimpses of vulnerability in Jason before, but never like this. It was as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him, and for the first time, I felt a genuine urge to comfort him. But how could I, when I was still struggling with my own feelings? Do you want to talk about it? I offered, trying to keep my voice neutral, though the question was loaded with a hope I couldn't quite suppress. He glanced at me, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. I'm not exactly known for sharing, am I? I returned his smile, though it was tinged with sadness. No, you're not. But maybe you should try it sometime. It might help. Jason looked away, his expression thoughtful. The silence between us stretched, filled with things neither of us dared to say. I could feel the walls he had built around himself, walls that I had tried and failed to breach. But in that moment, I realized that maybe I wasn't the only one trapped behind walls. Just when I thought he would brush off my offer and leave, he surprised me. Leo Blackwood, he said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. He's dangerous, Eve. Not just because of his business, but because of what he wants. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. And what does he want? Jason's eyes locked onto mine, the intensity in his gaze sending a shiver down my spine. He wants you, Eve. He's made it clear that he's interested in you, and I know what that interest entails. My breath caught in my throat. So it was true. Leo's interest in me wasn't just casual. It was something more, something that had driven Jason to confront him in the garden that night. But why did it matter so much to him? Why did he care? And why does that bother you so much? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. If this marriage is just a contract, why do you care if he's interested in me? Jason's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he leaned forward, his gaze burning into mine. Because it's not just about the contract, Eve. I won't let him use you, manipulate you like he does everyone else. You deserve better than that. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. There was something raw and genuine in his voice, something that made my heart ache. But I couldn't let myself believe it, couldn't let myself hope that there was more to his concern than just protecting me from Leo. You can't have it both ways, Jason, I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. You can't push me away and then act like you care about what happens to me. His eyes darkened, and he stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I don't want to push you away, Eve, but I can't give you what you want. I stood up as well, my emotions boiling over. And what is it that you think I want, Jason? He hesitated, his gaze searching mine as if trying to find the answer himself. More than what I can offer you, he finally said, his voice tinged with regret. My heart twisted at his words, the truth of them cutting deep. He was right, I wanted more. I wanted him, all of him, but I knew that wasn't possible. Not when he was so determined to keep his distance, to protect himself from whatever it was that kept him locked behind those walls. But before I could say anything else, before I could let the hurt and frustration spill out, Jason took a step back, his expression closing off once more. I'm sorry, Eve, he said quietly, the words heavy with finality. But this is how it has to be. And with that, he turned and left the library, leaving me standing there with my heart in pieces. The next morning, Jason was gone before I even woke up, and I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had settled in my chest. The mansion felt colder, more oppressive, and I found myself wandering the halls, searching for something I couldn't name. As the day wore on, I realized that I was done hiding, done pretending that my feelings didn't exist. I couldn't keep fooling myself. I was falling in love with Jason, despite everything, despite the pain it caused me. But I was also done waiting for him to make a move, to decide whether he wanted me in his life or not. I needed to take control of my own heart, to protect myself from the inevitable hurt that would come if I let these feelings grow any stronger. That evening, I made a decision. I would confront Jason, lay everything out on the table. If he couldn't give me what I needed, what I deserved, then I would walk away. It was the only way to save myself from the heartache that was surely coming. When he returned home late that night, I was waiting for him in the living room. He looked surprised to see me sitting there, but he quickly masked it, his expression slipping back into its usual guardedness. "Eve," he said cautiously, "what are you doing up?" I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, but I refused to back down. "We need to talk, Jason." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Can it wait until tomorrow? It's been a long day, and I'm exhausted." "No," I said firmly, my voice stronger than I felt. "It can't wait." He studied me for a moment, then nodded, resigned. "All right. What is it?" I took a deep breath, gathering my courage. "I can't do this anymore, Jason. I can't keep pretending that this marriage is just a contract, that I don't feel anything for you." His eyes widened slightly, and I could see the shock in his expression, but he quickly schooled his features into neutrality. "Eve." "No," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Let me finish. I've tried to keep my distance, to protect myself, but it's impossible. I'm falling in love with you, Jason, and I can't keep hiding that." His face softened, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flash of something, hope maybe, in his eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by that same cold distance. "I'm sorry, Eve," he said quietly, "but I can't give you what you want. I can't be the man you need me to be." The finality in his words was like a dagger to my heart, and I felt the tears welling up in my eyes. But I refused to let them fall. I refused to let him see how much he was hurting me. "Then I guess there's nothing left to say," I whispered, my voice trembling. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I felt his hand on my arm, pulling me back. I looked up at him, surprised by the desperation in his eyes. "Eve, wait," he said, his voice rough. "I don't want to lose you." "Then stop pushing me away," I pleaded, my heart breaking at the sight of his pain. "Stop pretending that you don't care." His grip on my arm tightened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to pull me into his arms, to finally let down those walls. But instead, he released me, stepping back as if he couldn't bear to be near me. "I can't," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." And with those words, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with my heart shattered into a million pieces. But as I watched him go, I realized something. I was done waiting, done hoping that he would change. I had to protect myself, to move on, even if it meant walking away from the man I was falling in love with. But even as I made that decision, A small voice in the back of my mind whispered that it wasn't over. Not yet.